Thank you for coming. My name is Robert Pasnow. I'm a professor of philosophy here at CU and the director of the Center for Western Civilization, Thought and Policy. This is part of a continuing series in which we explore conceptions of American identity and difference. And just a brief preliminary about that. These issues can be hard to talk about, and I expect and hope that there are people in this room that are coming from different points of view. That's kind of what we're all about, is bringing together people coming from different points of view. And so I hope you'll share those opinions. But because of those differences, I also hope you'll be respectful of other people's points of views, and that you'll listen to what everybody's saying. That's what we take the point of a university to be. Tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Tukufu Zuberi. He's the Lazary Family Professor of Race Relations at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a professor of sociology there and a professor of Africana Studies. He's the writer, producer, and director of the feature-length documentary African Independence. And you may also know him as a host of the PBS series History Detectives. He's the author of a great many articles and books, including particularly the book Thicker Than Blood: How Racial Statistics Lie, which argues that statistical analysis can and must be deracialized, and that the deracialization is essential to the goal of achieving social justice for all. So, without further ado, Dr. Zuberi.
Is it on? You can hear me now? Okay. I'll talk loud. How about that? I want to thank you very much for that kind introduction and for your invitation to participate in this conversation. And I want to thank Alex, I don't know if she's here, for all of her help in making the arrangements for me to have this opportunity to speak with you. And thank you for taking a moment of your time to come and listen to me. And I hope that we will be able to engage in a conversation. My remarks will take about 45 minutes to make, and then hopefully we can engage in a discussion about my comments. I have been I feel like I've been working on this project for many years. In 1999, I started to write the book that this particular topic is a chapter of, but I came to the conclusion that I was ill-prepared to write the book because I didn't really understand how you could study race. And this was me going through an intellectual crisis at that moment, because I had written many articles about race. I had written a book. My first book had a component in it which was trying to understand how racial statistics, and especially those statistics about mortality, and what they were used for, and to engage in the debates about slavery and deaths of slaves and the process of colonization and things of that nature. And this book was called Swing Low, Sweet Chariot: The Mortality Cost of Colonizing Liberia. And when I set out to write this book, and I realized that I had this kind of crash of consciousness about the use of statistics and about the study of, or the empirical study of race, I set about writing another book, which became a book called Thicker Than Blood: How Racial Statistics Lie, because I came to the conclusion that we were not using statistical analysis correctly when we analyzed race. And so now I think I have a better footing on what race is. I'll try to explain to you from my perspective what that is, and how race intersects with demography, population studies. And I'll try to give you a brief primer on that. And then I want to focus tonight on what I might call this fear of the white demographic suicide. Now, before there was an extensive amount of research by social psychologists on this, I had actually said that. And the social psychologists don't put it this way, but this is how I interpret what they're saying. And I hope you will see my point, and then we can talk about it, and you can tell me if I got it or not in your perspective. Doesn't mean I'm going to change it, but I definitely will listen to what you have to say about that. So the problem I see for us to talk about tonight is the idea of the post-racial world that we thought about a couple of years ago was a myth. It just did not happen. Some people thought once you elected an African-American president of the United States that then all the issues that we had in regards to race would vanish and disappear. But as Obama himself admitted, or at least he put out there, that's just an absurd idea. How was he going to eliminate something which had been a problem in the US for a couple of hundred years, and by all measures was still very prevalent in the society during the period of his tenure? I want to kind of take that conversation around the myth of the post-racial world and try to get a better idea on what race is, and then look at how the demography of the wow, that's got messed up there. So what you're reading, forget about that. What I want to do is talk about how the demography of race is a particular problem that we have created in many of our societies, and how does this work itself out. And then I want to talk about how populations, which are classified as white, express a fear of these changes. The changes are happening, and the expression of fear and the debate around that fear, we hear a loud commentary on. Many people talk about it. Many people have dedicated their careers now to explaining it. We get many names for what people are responding to. That is, you get this idea of the third demographic revolution that some people call it, increasing diversity of the population. Other people see it as. Okay, so population problems tend to end up also leading us to a conversation about our values, about our morals. And it took me a moment to really reflect on this, but I think that many of the great thinkers of population, they often conclude that what we see in the future is based on our evaluation of the past and the hopes for the future. And demographers are in a good position to talk about this because we spend a lot of time trying to get a long series of numbers to talk about what we're talking about now. And we like to use those numbers to think about where we will be in the future. So we spend a lot of time projecting the future from the numbers that we have, which then gives us a way of trying to situate the value and the currency of what we're talking about. For Malthus, Reverend Malthus, who wrote in the 19th century, Paul Ehrlich, Julian Simon, and even Joel Cohen, the population question is a moral issue. I don't know how I missed this, but when I went back to read their books and I read all of their conclusions, they had a conclusion on, well, really a lot of this, the way you're going to interpret it, depends on the values you have. It depends on whether you emphasize one thing or another thing. And that at least generated in me the possibility that the morality of this question is kind of rooted in our power to define who is a human deserving of dignity in the time and space in which we live. And this has become a very important consideration for me, and I think it has been a passion for demographers, although often not something they overtly considered as these authors do, but often demographers don't reflect on that particular aspect of why we end up with certain solutions and questions about what's going on. So the power to define who is human has been a very important kind of power. It has really determined the nature of identity in societies like the United States, Brazil, South Africa, France, Britain. It has defined who is a possible citizen in the nation, what the nation is, and the significance of a person's contribution to the nation. Now, demography was born using data that was collected for political reasons. The census data wasn't collected because people wanted to know the birth rates and the death rates. And in fact, we invented many methods to indirectly estimate from those data what information we needed. And became great data people because we're great manipulators and retooling of data in order to understand things about the world. These enumerations have been used to define what it means to be a human being. And I think this is one of the aspects that we've overlooked in our zealous use of much of the data to understand the patterns of populations on the planet Earth. So these counts often define or undefine who can be colonized, who can be enslaved, who can be otherwise marginalized in that context. So a major unrecognized preoccupation of demography has been race, especially if you take a country like the United States. I mean, the data sets that we use have often been prescribed or restricted in terms which are based on the classifications of who is what. And these classifications are often based on an observation of what's going on in the society. So for people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Sinclair Drake, and even Patricia Hill Collins, the race question is also a moral question. It is not a benign fact. A person is not white or a person is not black. It is a result of their particular positioning in the society. I want to be very clear about this point, so I want to be real clear about what I mean about race. Often people talk about race and they are not clear about what they mean, and so they, in that not being clear, almost hide the real impetus for their work, and they hide the implications of what their work is. Because if they haven't thought about it, then somebody did think about it, and they need to know who that is, because that will carry on in their work. And if they simply think not thinking about it is going to answer the question, it's going to create the same kind of mistake because they're going to end up at the same place. It's like a person saying, I'm colorblind and I'm going to study race. Well, I don't need the colorblind person to understand race. I need somebody who actually understands color to study race. I need someone who actually understands race to study race. The person who doesn't understand it's going to land here like a Martian. And I don't think Martians would be good students of human population. So, for me, race is not an illusion. It's kind of a real bad mistake to think race is an illusion. It's problematic because it undefines the problem that race is. If it's an illusion, all we have to do is get beyond the illusion, and then we'll be in the real world. And once we enter the real world, somehow we'll then be dealing with something. So, for me, I think, and I want to try to do this quickly, or kind of race 101 Tukufu Zuberi style. So just kind of stick with me, if you will. So I want to say race is not genetic. It is not genetic. On June 26 in 2000, after the assemblage of a working draft of the sequence of the human genome, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, I think Tony Blair actually videoed in at this conference, this meeting, that press conference that was held at the White House, and Francis Collins and Craig Venter all reconfirmed the lack of a genetic basis of race. That is, race has no genetic basis. And they based that on this. If race was genetic, then you should be able to reconstitute what the racial distribution of any population is without reference to the actual racial categories, but by simply focusing on the genomic structure of the individual, not the other way around. So that way you should be able to come back to the race. And they had done a number of these studies in both the private and the government-sponsored efforts at reconstituting the human genome. And they concluded that they couldn't do that. It was impossible to do that. If you took off the racial labels in the beginning, you couldn't then reconstitute who was supposed to belong to any particular race. The recent work of one of my colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Sarah Tishkoff, and her colleagues stand out as a more recent debunking of the persistent idea of race as a biological idea. So I think what the point here is that race is not genetic. It's not genetic. I would also say race is not a system of color. You know, in some ways I want to say, you all know Richard Pryor. Have any of you ever heard of Richard Pryor, the comedian? You know, and Richard Pryor tells this joke about, you know, his wife catches him in the bedroom with another person, and he tells her immediately, wait, don't believe your lying eyes. And in some ways, I want to say that about race, because we all know we can look at a person, and from looking at them, we can know what their race is. And, you know, in a big way, I think that that's a delusion. We really don't know what a person is by looking at their physical composition. What we do know is how they've been classified in this particular space. But the idea of race as a system of color requires us to think with a white logic, which I'm suggesting to you is not logic. It's a kind of distortion of logic. And it is to confirm the white logic with irrational arguments. And if you will, I think if we think it out, we get there. But Tishkoff and her colleagues put it this way. What they find is all of the variations of colors in skin color in Africa. And that they argue that humans cannot be divided in races which are supposed to have ancestry in Africa, ancestry in these other places, because basically all of those variations could be found in Africa, to put it simply. Let's take that. I want to be very precise about this point. And so just look at the precision of it, and I think it makes sense. Scientifically, human visual perception of color comes from the simulation of cells in the human eye by electromagnetic radiation in the spectrum of light. And in the spectrum of light, you can't mix these two colors because white reflects all colors and black is the absence of color. Now, another way of putting this, and I think it helps us see the irrational, illogical way we use these terms and how that can be expressed in large populations, is to think of a person, right? Everybody can think of a black person. You can imagine what a black person is, right? Everybody with me? Raise your hand if you can imagine what a black person is. Okay. Raise your hand if you can imagine what a white person is. Now, all of that seems logical until you get a black person and you put them in the bed with a white person, leave them overnight, take all their clothes away, make sure one of them is a man and one of them is a woman for my mind experiment. Let them do what they're going to do. Turn some music on, burn some candles and incense, whatever needs to happen. Open a bottle of wine. In the morning, there may be a pregnancy. And let's say that pregnancy goes to full term and is delivered. Now, what you would expect to get is a gray baby, right? That's the logical thing. The logical thing is you would expect to get a gray baby. But if you got a gray baby, and I've consulted with medical professionals about this, if you got a gray baby, the first thing they would do is immediately try to resuscitate the baby. because they would think that there was a problem with air and all these other things, and then they would move it if that didn't change the color of the baby. So we operate on the basis of thinking and you know, we use it. It's our popular way of talking about of a black person and a white person. Even though we know among those white people we might know some who are close to white. It'll be rare. And some who are very far away from white. And with those people we think are black people, there are some of them that we will say they are as black as their hair. And others who are almost white, not, but almost kind of white. So the absurdity of thinking that the black exist and the white exist is a consequence of how race has been done in order to create a group which, in fact, could not exist. But this has been very important for our understandings of race. That is, the illogical belief in race as skin color is a social construction in itself, and it varies by society. So a person who is black in the United States may not be black in Brazil and may have problems defending their blackness in South Africa, and vice versa. So the transformation of these ideas over time further confuses and confounds the notion of who is white and who is black. At one point, Irish were not generally considered white, especially those who came with the big migration of Protestants to the United States. At one point, Jews were not considered white, right? And in some societies, that rebirths itself in its process. So, a summary of my Race 101 then leads us to what I think race is, which I would argue race is a socially constructed idea to facilitate inequality. I have tried to find the society that is a peaceful, racially diverse society. Society where they sit at the racial table and they negotiate the resources and their allocation to people. A society in which people sit around and say, this is how we're going to have racial peace. Where there is race, there is racial conflict. Where there is race, there is racial prejudice. Race is based on these prejudices and these conflicts. So what do I mean race is socially real in that way? The consequences of these divisions that we have made, illogical as they may be, have had real impacts on the populations so classified, especially those populations which are marginalized in the classification. So when the U.S. Census classified the indigenous population as uncivilized, the census. When the U.S. Constitution classified the indigenous population, the Native American population, as uncivilized, and the enslaved population as 3/5 a person, it was in itself trying to socially define the reality of race as practiced in the society. The indigenous were treated as if they were uncivilized as a way of justifying the mission of colonization in the United States. The designation of the those who came enslaved as 3/5 a person was a classification of them as secondary human beings, as second-class human beings, as less than full human beings. So racial categories may be artificially defined by human beings using religion, culture, and physical appearance, but the implications are real. They are socially real because people are hierarchically allocated in the society by these classifications. Now there's a big, large field of research I could use to explain this to you, so I'm just summarizing that so that we can talk about my fancy graphs that I'll start showing you in a minute. So race is a hierarchical system of human relations, a system arranged in order of rank. That's why I was saying, I don't know of any society, and please help me know of a society where there is racial peace and harmony. There is always racial conflict where there is race. By racially defining the population, the desire is to racially marginalize part of the population. There is nothing about white people that makes them white, besides the fact of racial classification, using this system to justify various forms of inequality within the society. So all race occurs within a national context, and all nations experience racial transitions, and in societies with white supremacy, there persists a fear of white demographic suicide. It becomes a major motivating factor, and in the last 30 or 40 years, it has become a major preoccupation. I mean, the history of it could probably date back to some of the passages in Malthus's Principle of Population written in the 19th century.
Why would whites suicide? Why would whites kill themselves?
I'm going to try to explain it. Follow me. Follow me. Because I haven't really gotten to the suicide part, but I'm going to get there. Now, this is the demographic transition. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but it is a word I'm going to use, so I want you to understand what I mean by that. Demographic transition is a question about population growth and the status of a population, especially in regards to the natural increase of the population, especially in regards to the births and the deaths. Okay, so in stage one, you have high births and high deaths. And as you can see, the total population is relatively low compared to the other stages. In stage two, you still have high birth rates, but the mortality rate drops, so there is a tremendous growth in the population. In stage three, the birth rates begin to fall and the death rates fall more slowly. And so you have still an increase in the population. Stage four, you have low birth weights and low mortality rates, which is what the human population is approaching everywhere, although some regions like Africa and certain parts of Asia continue to have more high fertility rates and to some relatively high compared to other populations, mortality rates. And you get to the fifth stage, which we are approaching, which is where we have very low birth rates and very low death rates. Some populations have birth rates which are so low that the population growth becomes negative and there's population decline. So demographically, race has had a profound impact on humanity. Now, the Columbian Exchange is an idea that we have heard quite a bit of in the last 20 or so years. And the idea here, and especially for demographers, has been that the population reached 1 billion around 1800 because of the Columbian Exchange, between 1500 to 1800. But I think now, if we kind of take the blinders off, we could conclude that the human population reached 1 billion around 1800 because of the sacrifices of the indigenous populations in Africa, Asia, and the Americas and some islands. That is, the story is not only told by the new food sources that went to Europe, not only told by the ability of European and what some people have called the new Europes outside of Europe, having accelerated population growth because of the nutrients and because of the wealth now being accumulated to improve the populations. Now, what is this exchange? This is an image of the exchange. I think I'm not working there. How about here? Oh, there we go. So this is what I call the first demographic racial transition. And that is occasioned by the great dispersion of people from Europe and the creation of a tremendous European diaspora. in the United States, in Canada, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Colombia, in New Zealand, in Australia. And this European diaspora really transformed the spaces in which they landed, because they brought with them a form of colonization that often meant the devastation of the indigenous populations that were there. One of their responses to this devastation of the populations present was to then enslave large numbers of Africans to supplement the process of colonization. And this map is just my effort at showing it. So it's more a graphic demonstration than it is a fact. Now, in the 19th century, for the most part, the number of Africans who were transported for this labor needs, it was reduced substantially. And then after that, many people were brought from Asia to also supplant these needs, or to fulfill these needs in these other parts of the world. So I want to give you two examples of the impact of the Columbian devastation. The first is to look at Africa. So, and I want to do it relative to populations on Earth. And so this is the African population relative to other populations on the planet. And this is, you know, between 1400 and 1600. And this is that African population relative to other populations on the earth during the main period of enslavement. So there was a lot of people taken out of Africa and moved to areas in the Americas and to areas in Asia. And Africa's proportion of the human population declined very substantially. Now, between after 1850, this kind of mellowed out and it didn't happen anymore. That's one example. Second example is the United States. And what you see here is the decline of the indigenous population, the Native American population, as a percentage of the population in the space that we define as the United States. One of my points here is the power to racially define is a very important power. The power to racially define is a very important power. Because what I've suggested to you, remember my three things. One, race is not genetically real, so there is really no genetically race, there is no genetically white population or genetically any population. And race is not about color. So there really is only a population that is classified as white, a population that is classified as black, a population that is classified as all of these races, and those classifications differ. If you look at the system of racial classification in Colombia, it is quite different than the system of racial classification in the United States. So who has the power to define? And it's not people. People don't come together and say, we the people. There are customs in a society which lead people to make those kinds of definitions. Now, enumerations are used to define the rights of a class of people. And this is where the whole kind of demography of it gets tied in, because demographers, we tend to think we're talking about these people who are defined in these specific ways. And these classes, and using these classes of definition, are the ways in which we do the analyses that we do, because we believe that we have basically done the right thing in doing it. But it is our process of then constructing race in a particular way that finds its way both in the research we do and in the results that we produce. So these counts define or undefine who can be colonized, enslaved, and otherwise marginalized. That's why I say the documents we use, the numbers we use, are often not, we are not the main reason people are collecting data that demographers use to analyze the population. So to understand the changes in the demography of a population, in part, we must construct who is part of that population. And to do that, we have to define and undefine who is countable or not. Now, systems of racial classification are time and place specific. That's why I say, for example, with race in Brazil, South Africa, and the United States, people who are white are not the same. Being white in Brazil does not mean you will be white when you land in the United States. Being white in South Africa does not mean that you will be white when you arrive in the United States or in South Africa or in Brazil. All of these definitions of race are time specific as well. My favorite example is there was a president of Georgetown University. Now, this president, he was born on a plantation in Georgia, I'm sorry. And when he was born there, his father was a very wealthy plantation owner. And he gave a lot of money to the Catholic Church. And he sent all of his children to be educated and reared by the Catholic Church. And they all came back to normal jobs in the United States. Now, no mention was made in this process of them getting their education and all of this. Nothing was mentioned about the mother of the children, who was one of the rich guy in Georgia's slaves. And so he sent them away to get educated, and they came back and they lived lives of being white. Now, nobody really said that Georgetown had a black president in the 19th century. And in fact, it was only when some researcher discovered that the mother was one of the enslaved women on the plantation in Georgia that Georgetown could then claim that it had the first black president of a university in the United States. Now, the interesting thing about that to me is that not only was it the question of having the first black president, whether an HBCU or anything else, but that his racial identity could change, and it changed across time. And it could be a debated issue about it. And you see similar debates in Brazil about very important and famous individuals. They get reclassified based on the racial classification used at the time and based on the information about who they were drawn from that kind of thing. Now, I want to give you 3 examples of the social construction of the racial transition away from the white population dominance, okay? And let's be clear on what I just said for you, because I want to give you 3 examples of the social construction of the racial transition away from white population dominance. And I made these calculations with my own hands, and I did that intentionally, and I may have made a mistake or 2 there. I'll fix that up as I take this forward towards publication. But this is the racial distribution in the United States. I'm very proud of this picture in many ways because it took me a long time to do it. So I'm going to take a small breath and let you soak it totally in. But you'll notice that the red population is the red population that I referred to, and that shows you the transition to the white population, and you see that happening with the growth of the white population there. You see the little yellow in there, that's when you start getting significant numbers of people from Asia who are classified here as Asian. Then you have your brown in there. I guess I should make that black to get it right, but you got your brown in there. Maybe that's right, I don't know. And then you got a lighter brown showing the Latino population. And I did that this way because I wanted to be consistent with the classifications used in the census data. I obviously could probably take those estimates back if I used geography to kind of place and situate people. And maybe I would do that, but I think I like this point better. Now, the reason I say this is a racial construction is because I made decisions like that. I determined who was Latino and who was not. I determined who was black and who was not. And in the black, I determined who was black because the black didn't have to be black. They could have been mulatto. They could have been whatever classification was used at that time in that census. But I constructed it this way based on my notion now of what racial classification should mean. But there's no reason, theoretically, there's no reason that I did not classify some of those people who were black as white. Why not? They had a white parent and a black parent. There's no rule, theoretically, there's no set rule that makes them black or white. And I did that because of the rules in this country that are used to make someone black and white. And therefore, the construction of this across time is something that I did. And we must do this if I'm going to have a range of data so that I could produce a statistic that would try to summarize this data. This is the statistic that I produced to summarize this data. This is an index of diversity. So the more evenly distributed the racial groups are, then the higher this number is. So when you're increasing diversity, this number will be going up. When you're decreasing diversity, this number will be going down. Okay? And so you can see this where it turns here around 1950. You can see that turn is being driven by the Latino population being counted. And what I've done with my line is the top line is counting all Latinos as Latinos. The bottom line allows the 45% of the Latinos in the 2010 census who said that they were white be white. And therefore, the amount of diversity goes down. Now, whether that will happen in the next census or not, or how that resolves itself out, we will see. There are debates and discussions about the racial classification and what we should do with the Latino population, especially when they check the wrong box. And determining who checks the wrong box and when it's the wrong box is then again part of our construction. There has never been a genetic classification of the race of a population. Hitler was not able to do that. He claimed that. And their whole eugenic or race program was about that. But putting stars on people wasn't. They didn't do a genetic test and say, you are a Jew, we are going to do that. They didn't do a genetic test to say, you are this, and we're going to treat you in this particular way. They did it because of their social construction at that time of who was and was not an Aryan. And the relative position of other people to that led to the kind of classification that they had. And so I'm trying to suggest to you that this beautiful graph is in part a construction of mine. There is some science in it, but in order to get the science to work, I have to be very creative, and I have to make decisions about who is white and who is black. Because who is white and who is black in the past is a result of this construction that I have had to make. The United States is not the only place with the luxury of having white supremacy or racial stratification. This is Brazil, a close neighbor to ours. And here I've taken the data from 1872 to 2010, which is the data we have to work with. And I've constructed them in racial categories based on the systems they use in Brazil in 2010. And so then I went through every year, I took the racial classifications and I put them in groups that matched the groups that I wanted to have them in, whether they were black, brown, white, Asian, and I put them in their group from 1872 up until 2010. Where they didn't have the data for it, I estimated it between the 2 years and made it nice and smooth, because we like nice and smooth too. Or we like to really have the jerks in demography. We like to look at trends. And so I calculated my index of racial diversity for this population as well. And you will see. And part of what happened in Brazil that is very interesting to me and very important for us. It gives us another example of the changing construction of race. So Brazil is now a majority black country. How did Brazil become a majority black country? Brazil did not become a majority black country because black people have more babies than white people in Brazil. Let me say that another way, probably more precise. Brazil did not become a population in which the majority are classified as black because the population classified as black had more babies than the population classified as white. Right? Could have said the same thing about Colombia. They had this move as well, but not the majority, but a dramatic rise in the population classified as black. Same thing in Ecuador, same thing in Peru. Why did it? And then Mexico, you see the last census in Mexico, they added a racial classification. So what's going on in those spaces? What's going on in those spaces is a reconsideration of what race means and who is what. A reconsideration about what it means to be black, what it means to claim an African ancestry, what it means to claim to be part of the African diaspora, which it is virtually impossible not to be. Now, South Africa for me is always a very cherished example. And South Africa is probably different than Brazil because the rise in the percentage of the population that is black, the rise of the percentage of the population that is classified as black is a result of more births going to the population that is classified as black. Now, the population being classified as black is new. I remember when I first started collaborating with people at the Census Bureau in South Africa, and they were having a big debate on what to do with racial classification. Then it's in South Africa, we gotta have racial classification, but how do we introduce racial classification? Well, first they had to amend the new census, and then they had to amend the policies about continuing to collect racial data, because they had a very immediate experience with using those classifications to exploit and directly prohibit people from participating equally in the society. So that had to change. But in changing it, they found that they were not able to even recognize some of the problems they wanted to change unless they had this data. And so they reintroduced the data. And in order to get some of the data, some of these estimates, even for South Africa, I had to make very creative choices about who was what. Okay? So I had to say, if a person is Zulu, then they are black. If a person is something else, then they are black. I had to make those decisions, and I had to do the classifications based on that. Not because that was the most salient thing about their identity at that moment in South Africa, because at that moment in South Africa, the population which is classified as Zulu was in great conflict with the ANC and the majority population in South Africa based on other issues. So you can see that the index of racial diversity is going down in South Africa and is being driven by differential rates of increase based on the classification of the different populations. Now these demographic, how long have I been going? About 40 minutes? So? Okay. I built that in to kind of take you down to a quick end here. So these demographic racial transitions that I've shown you are socially real, okay? And I just want to emphasize to you that they are constructed by the political and economic processes in which they exist. But they have been met with white fear among white populations. They've been met with white fears among white populations in Brazil, in the United States, in all over Europe. That is people, and this is what, so there's a group of social psychologists, and this is just some of the work that they've done or been doing in the last decade or so. And they have been asking people this question: how do you feel? You know, which is interesting to me because I'm a demographer, and demographers usually didn't ask this question, but they've been asking this question. How do you feel about the future of the population growth in the country? How do you feel about that? And, you know, people will give them their views. And then they added, how do you feel about the fact that the future of this country will not be as white as it was in the past. And when they ask them those two questions, one question, people don't have a problem with population growth. Okay, some of you may think they should have a problem, because you may have a whole thing about the fear of population growth. But that's not really what they were expecting. They didn't have a problem with growth in their neighborhood, with growth in the coming of people. They didn't even have a problem with the immigrants coming into their population. What they had a problem with is when those immigrants were different, when those immigrants were culturally different, when those immigrants were religiously different, when those immigrants did not pose to be a group that could be integrated within their particular group. So they had a fear of the increasing diversity that would be in the population. Now, this is a survey among people. If you do a survey among scholars, some of who should know better, you see them saying the same thing. They fear the loss of Western culture, of Western civilization in the United States, in Britain, in France, right, in Germany. They fear this to such an extent that they would bar people entry and bar people from participating and making contributions to society because of an anticipation of something that's happening that they don't seem to have control of. So for me, that's a problem, this fear of this fear of the growing diversity of the population in those spaces where people have thought of the civilization being grounded in one particular culture. And there is no civilization that exists like that. We can get into the mythological idea that somehow Western civilization is coming out of Western places and not part of the global development of communication and humanity. You have to get beyond where science really comes from, where math really comes from, and how humans have really circulated ideas to give birth to what we're calling Western civilization. So the fear of white demographic suicide is resulting in more calls for international and domestic apartheid. That is, we hear people talking about building barriers to prevent people having access to them. And sometimes that means creating a large space to house these new immigrants, these people who are not considered to be assimilable, people who are not considered to be appropriate parts of the society in which they might be. And so, as a short kind of end to it, and then we can talk about it more, I think we need to end the fear of demographic racial suicide among scholars and everyday people. And one way to do that is to eliminate some of the mythology that surrounds the identities that we have. One barrier, which is the one that I've been talking about, is kind of grounded in the mythology we have about color, we have about genetics, and we have about the history that has gotten us to now. Du Bois once wrote a book called Black Reconstruction. And in the first chapter, it was on the black worker. The first chapter was on the black worker. In this book, he argued this: we've had the wrong idea about who built capitalism. Because if you want to know who built capitalism, it should be a question about the workers. That is, who built capitalism. And definitely no plantation owner built the wealth on his plantation. Probably didn't build a house. Probably did not build the bed that he was sleeping in. Definitely did not cook his own food and all of these other things. And he probably was very disrespectful and mean to some of his children. Probably not the children of the wife, but the children of the enslaved. In fact, he might even pass laws, he did pass laws that left them in a very marginalized space. So this idea we have about who is a good human being and who is not a good human being poses several problems for us to realize today, but they are grounded in the historical experiences of what kinds of societies we have built in the last 500 years. Thank you for your attention.
Questions? Yes.
I'm not a demographer or scholar or anything. I'm just a citizen of Boulder. And I have an ignorant question, perhaps, but is the census going to allow people to mark mixed?
It will allow people to select more than one category.
But they have to pick two categories. They can't just say, I'm mixed.
I'm not sure what it's going to do right now, okay? But in the past, it has allowed individuals to select more than one category. And in the past, individuals have selected when they weren't supposed to.
Could somebody select 3 categories?
In the past, they have collected. In this past census, they were able to do that. Yes.
Okay, but you don't know if they're going to keep that.
I'm not sure what the rules are going to be as of 2020. I don't know. Does anybody know? I'm not sure yet.
Okay.
But I do know there's been a debate about it.
Yeah.
And the last I heard, people were going to be allowed to select multiple categories.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, so loved the talk, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Fascinating. So the word suicide sort of implies that whites are sort of responsible for their own decreasing demographic. Why do you use such an intentional word such as suicide?
Yeah, so one part that I didn't talk much about in this talk is that. And so this idea of racial suicide is an idea which comes from the eugenics movement in the early parts of the 20th century. And here the notion was that white women were not having enough babies, and that this act of not having enough babies was a committing suicide against the race. So the racial suicide was a consequence of not having sufficient number of babies. And then it was also because the other groups were having larger groups of babies. So since you're in a population in one space, one group having more babies and you having less babies was considered to be a kind of racial suicide. And so the rearticulation of this is being expressed in today as people kind of talk about immigration and talk about the birth rates among those populations which are racially marginalized populations. Too many babies for poor black women, too many babies for Latinos coming over the border, even bringing their babies. A lot of conversation about babies and whether they should be snatched from their parents as a way to discourage them from even considering coming to the United States. And so the suicide is basically written in that. And then you have this question all over Europe right now where many of the populations are either at or below, or they go a little bit above and a little bit below a replacement fertility, which means there is a decline of the population not engaged in, in the reproduction of the population. There's a decline of the indigenous population, let's say for France or for Britain, whereas the immigrants arriving they have a higher fertility rates, and by virtue of them entering the population already, it's kind of like a double whammy. If you come and then you have a baby and you're in that society, and that society is supposed to be grounded in a Western civilization, right? And so the contradiction of that is this, right? That the Prime Minister, for example, in 1912, the Prime Minister of Britain was at a meeting in New York, and he stood up to give a presentation. And he said, you know, the United States talks about its black population, and its black population is so small because we have hundreds of millions of blacks in our population. Right? And everybody in the audience laughed because, of course, he was talking about Africa, in which the largest number of people on the African continent existed in British colonies. And so they didn't exist necessarily in Britain. The black population in Britain was very small. But Britain could claim them because that was British territory. And the French could also claim that because that was French territory. They could do it also in terms of other parts of the world where they had these colonies. So now you enter another space where here comes the colonized, and they're re-entering the space, often because of the difficulties they have with surviving in now war-torn eras like Syria and Libya and, and Somalia and different parts of the world where they're trying to escape, trying to live lives like everyday people. And they're trying to escape being caught up in the political and the economic battles being fought all over the world, or being fought in their space as a kind of world war. Because it's not necessarily even them which are involved in the war. Sometimes they're captured in their own space and they disperse. And so shouldn't the world respond to that? I mean, they were ready to celebrate them as part of their colonized. How about now?
Very thought-provoking. Thank you very much. That was really an interesting talk. Are there countries, or in general, are countries around the world increasing in diversity? You showed the graph for...
Right. In general, countries around the world are, where we're at a moment where we can see the impact of their image of diversity, right?
Right.
And so, for example, very recently, China passed a law to change how Islam was defined in a big part of China, because China has a very significant Islamic population. And they wanted to make the definition of a Muslim compatible with the definition of the state, of being a citizen in the state, more compatible with communism, as they put it. And so when they did this, of course, there was not a lot of agreement among the people who were being classified in this new way. But that wasn't a problem because they had already started imprisoning large numbers of them and building spaces for them to be housed, to be given more education about their proper way to identify themselves in their lives. So here we get an admission in China of the diversity that exists in China. Kind of a divergence from the Han kind of idea that we usually get about China. And, and we all hear about Tibet, but we didn't have that much of a conversation, at least a public conversation. The scholars knew, and in the last 20 years, there's been just a blossoming of research on the diversity in China, where everybody thinks everybody's a Chinese. Well, of course, they're all the Chinese, but there's a diversity among the Chinese population. And there are some populations which have been marginalized because of their identity within the country as it's constituted. Given that, and if you do the history of most countries, especially the countries that scream the loudest about their monoracial identity, you begin to find there's ticks in that monoracial identity which are reflected in how they have stratified people in different ways and put them in classes which really don't necessitate being counted in that way. So I would say on one hand, there is a growing recognition that many countries already have the diversity. The question is, how do they treat this diversity? And how do they call out these people's differences? And then how, in the end, especially today, it gets kind of mirrored in a kind of biologizing of what they say that identity is. And when it gets that way, people are using the modern scientific way, kind of really mastered in the United States, of giving these classifications which kind of mirror the social and the economic distributions of the population.
So it seems to me, and I'm not going to be as articulate here because this is not my area, but it seems to me that there might be a methodological challenge or a conundrum projecting forward, because as you said, in identifying and putting together some of your graphs for where we are today, you've had to use some imagination and some construction to make those identities now. So if those identities shift, as people think of themselves differently moving forward, then wouldn't that also have a shift on your future projections?
Exactly. That's my point.
And it seems like a good thing to me.
Yeah, but that's yeah. It might be a good thing, but some of it depends on how the classifications are used in the society.
Yes, exactly.
They asked Du Bois, this guy I was talking about again, y'all should check out Du Bois, he's a smart guy. The Census Bureau asked Du Bois to comment in 1920 on it was basically a question, how many white people are really black? Because that makes sense in the United States, right? Because in the United States, you know, it's just, if they got any black blood in them, they're black. They couldn't be white. So now that doesn't work in other places, but it works in the United States. And so Du Bois came back with an estimate that 20% of the white population was actually black, right? And didn't get a lot of plus or play, but many of the things that did do it, because it was commissioned by the Census Bureau, they said, oh yeah, that's Du Bois. We know Du Bois and the color line and all of these other things. But his point is we often look at this question the wrong way, right? We're interested in how much white blood is in the black population. And people tried to classify that. We even created names for it, you know, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon. We had all kinds of classifications in the United States. And this is mirrored in places like Brazil, mirrored in places like Mexico, mirrored in places like Colombia. In their history, you will see that they have these systems of classification, which were trying to discern who is free and who is not free. And in that freedom, how much social ridicule will they or will they not receive? And so one thing is to capture that at a moment. And I'm saying that takes a degree of creativity. But demographers seem to be good at creativity. You saw my pretty figures, and I could just not told you I constructed them, that they're facts, and you would go away believing that. I just added this whole construction part because it's what my point was. And my point was that other people have constructed these similar graphs, and I'm trying to tell you that they had a creative moment just like I did, and they probably ended up with the same kind of categories that I did. In projecting forward, it's the same issue. Because what category does a baby who has a white father and a white mother, or a white mother and a black father, or a Asian father and a black grandmother, what are they in this going forward? And we make decisions, right? We make decisions on who's going to be classified as white and who's going to be classified as black. Now, for me, it's not a benign decision. For some, it's just a benign decision. Just decide and then make them that. But for me, it's a stigma that the person will carry for the remainder of their life. Now, that stigma could also be a reflection of their shared social circumstances with other people who are so who also receive the same classification, right? And so I think you are correct. It is based on the creativity, both in the past, the now, and the future.
Okay, next question. Yeah, right here.
I wonder if ending what you call the fear of white demographic suicide is any different than ending racism. And if in fact it is the same, if there's any prospect that it might in fact happen.
So I'm optimistic in this because we have history on our side, right? And this is the history we have on our side. The United States used to be a society in which over 20% of the population was enslaved. Now, it took a war and a lot of other effort for a long time in order to end that. And ending that enslavement had a kind of revolutionary impact on the world in terms of the place and the situation of those individuals who had been enslaved. And they changed and began a process of totally transforming what we call a human being. Now, I get that up into as recently, and now you even have new discussions about the humanity of the people who are supposed to be classified as black. You have those conversations here. You have those conversations in Brazil. You have those conversations in Colombia. You have those conversations in South Africa. You have those conversations all over Europe. That is, the conversations about if these people who are the racially marginalized are in their situation because of something that is essentially them, not something that is a result of their shared social circumstance. Is there something about the pigmentation in the skin that gives one a high IQ or a low IQ, right? And this has been going on for a long time and it is not gone. Is there something about the amount of pigment in a person's skin that sends them to prison or sends them to Harvard? Is there something going on there? And so, do I have hope that that can change? Well, I mean, you know, given what the climate scientists say, we may not be here to witness the total manifestations of this change. But if we are to have a world in which there is a better opportunity for equity, a better opportunity for social justice, a better opportunity to have human rights generally applied, then that will come from us getting beyond the notion of racially marginalizing significant parts of our population.
Well, I would agree entirely, but when I view the history of race relations, it does not seem to me to be a linear process of improvement. It seems to me that there are definite ups and downs, and I find it somewhat difficult to be as optimistic as you seem to be.
Yes, because my pessimism is extreme. And my pessimism is extreme. It means you have to take extreme measures. But I think the ending of enslavement in the United States was a revolutionary act. The ending of enslavement in Brazil and Cuba was a revolutionary act. The independence movements around Asia were revolutionary acts. And what I mean by revolutionary is they increased the dignity of the human beings who were marginalized within those particular constellations of society. And I see those as improvements. And I would suggest that we will either make those improvements, because people don't suffer marginalization peacefully. They don't suffer marginalization just agreeing with it. They tend to want to rebel against their marginalization. And that's why I'm saying in the United States, to end enslavement, we had to have a war. I hope we don't have to have another war to finally eliminate the last vestiges of the racial hierarchy which came into form these last 500 years.
You talk about one group that's been so classified as having more babies and another group having fewer babies. But what is the rate of intermarriage? And because my understanding is it's going up quite dramatically, especially in the last 10 or 15 years. And what effect will that have on what I see as a positive thing is the homogenation of the society?
Yeah, so in racially stratified societies, they tend to rebel against what you're calling that, so that they find a way to think about it, right? And for example, so you got the Latino population. Is the Latino population a race or is it an ethnic group? You get this conversation. And then you have the fact that large numbers of Latinos classify themselves as white. Well, now recently you've had significant numbers of Latinos classifying themselves as black, and even having a kind of sub-movement within the movement of Latinos to be recognized as black Latinos. Because inside of Ecuador, this division is very real. Inside of Colombia, this reality is crystal clear. And in Brazil, it is kind of a manifestation which is part of the national debate of the character of the country. So if you take these groups of countries, including the United States, where this is happening, they develop rules on how you classify these people. Do you classify them as mixed? Do you allow them to check boxes and then determine post hoc what you will classify them as, whether they will be able to be Latino and Black, or whether they will be able to be, something with something else, and what does that mean in terms of their classification, in terms of the distribution of resources, in terms of understanding whether equality exists in that particular space. So there are ways in which these numbers have significance, right? And does it lead to homogenization? Not necessarily, because that's what people argued in Brazil for a long time, right? They called it a racial democracy. They said they didn't have any racial problems like they had in the United States because people were treated as human beings. Well, it turns out that that was not the case and never has been the case, but there has been that kind of rhetoric that race is not a problem, that the only problem with race is the people who are saying they are classified as Black are demanding rights as Black, which is then considered the problem. So the racially marginalized get blamed for their racial marginalization, which there's a long history of doing that in Brazil, in Colombia, and many parts of Latin America. So when you get into the United States, that's kind of overt, right? I mean, you'll have people standing around saying, well, the reason so many African Americans are poor is because, and they'll tell you what it is that African Americans do to make themselves poor.
Okay, in the back, yes.
Hey, hello. My name is Berta. I'm a grad student here at CU. And my question is going to be very selfish and maybe naive. But so I'm teaching right now a class in U.S. race and ethnicity in the United States. And as a women of color, international scholar, I'm wondering, because every time I stand in front of my students, I say some sort of what you just said right now, but they dub it all the time. And they're like, well, you're Mexican, you have a thick accent, I don't know. And they dub all the time what I said about how racial disparities work in this country, and also it work in the world. So I'm wondering, what advice you have to teach about disparities and racial disparities, and to make, mostly in this campus that we have, a majority of white students in our classrooms, and to believe us that this is an important issue that we have to think about.
So I've been a professor now for about 31 years. And so I think it's always a problem in trying to think about what we're doing. And so I would say this to you: you may not be able to convince them that you are correct, and that's not necessarily your job. I would suggest to you that your job is to provide them with the information so that they can carry this as part of their kind of information when they're making decisions about life. I think that if you're effective, you will have presented to them a sense of the problems that they're being confronted with, so that they may hear very powerful people say very different things than you're saying, right? They may hear very powerful people say that the problem with Mexicans is this, that, and the other thing. And so they may hear, and they may actually enter your space with a notion that Mexicans have this set of problems. And so when they first see you and hear you, of course, they see and hear the problems. And then in their mind, they're trying to work out how that's going to be related to the test they're going to take and to the grade they're going to get, all right? We get real about it, right? And so if that's the reality that they're confronted with, I think we are tasked with providing them a different perspective, so that they might contemplate a different way of looking at themselves and others. Because part of their construction of their whiteness is to create what they think are white spaces. And so if they think this is a white space, then they will find it strange that you are here with your accent. You see, because what are you, a Mexican, doing in this space trying to teach them? And so the juxtaposition of the power and their need to reconcile in their own self that they are sitting in a class in a space in which they are supposed to be comfortable receiving information from a person who they don't have that much social respect for. They may have individual respect for you, but they're getting all this information that you are part of the problem. So part of giving them this alternative perspective is to get them to come out of their comfort zone of white supremacy and to enter a possibility that they could communicate with the people who they have been told are bad. And I think it's always a problem. Because, you know, it could be a problem. It could be reflected in your, I don't know if you all do this here, but there's, in many universities, at the University of Pennsylvania, the students fill out a form after the class and they can rate the professor's performance. And in many places, people use these ratings to determine whether someone will get tenure or not. And so this is something, they don't look at this dimension, however. Like, what is the relationship of those scores that they get in these teacher evaluations to the fact that the professor has tried to challenge them in an area which is not just solve the equation, but is change your mind and change your ideas, or at least confront the reality that not everybody thinks you are who you are, and that where you think you're hiding is not a space to hide, because we're here and we see you, and it's no longer your space once we're here.
Thank you.
Another question back, and then up here is...
I'm going to put you on the spot because I think I don't actually disagree with anything you said, but you make a lot of really interesting points. And I think one of the conclusions that I draw, at least, is that these artificially constructed categories are inherently problematic and not particularly useful in a political sense. And that when we use them politically, they cause nearly as many problems as they solve. Whether they're used, I mean, we're trying to use them for benevolent purposes right now, but it seems like it's further dividing things. And I mean, that's the conclusion I draw from what you're saying, but I really doubt that that's the conclusion you reach. And I'd like to tell you, I'd like you to speak to that point.
Mm-hmm. I don't think I think they've been very politically effective. I think racism has been one of the most effective social constructions that we've had. I mean, and it has been a very powerful social construction. We have fought world wars around this. I mean, you know, if you imagine one of the impetuses for fighting World War I was the distribution of colonies, especially the lack of colonies of Germany. And one of the motivations in World War II was also this lack of colonies. And if you remember, the war is supposed to have started in Poland, but actually a lot of the conflict started in Africa and in China and around who owned what colony. So the strategy of white supremacy and having a kind of white logic in interpreting identity has been very effective as a political instrument for dividing power and maintaining power and justifying inequality. Because if you can say that half your population or the majority of your population is disadvantaged because of their race, you've answered a lot of the questions about the society. I mean, you could imagine being in a society like South Africa, for example. Before the end of apartheid, there was much justification why the majority was in such a marginalized position. And part of that was used to justify the spatial and economic segregation that was used to distribute the great wealth of that society. The same thing in the colonial relationships that existed. So in those kind of majority marginalized racial populations, you get a certain interpretation of what's going on. So I think it has been a very effective political strategy. I think more recently, it has been a very effective political strategy as well. I mean, if you watch the process of elections from 2004 to 2008 to 2012, or just focus on 2008 to 2012, I mean, if you look at the states where the elections took place, Obama won primarily in 2008 because of coalitions which were predominantly white coalitions in terms of the voters in the states that he won. By 2012, that had totally changed. It was only a few of those states existed, and most of the states in which he won, it was because of a very heavy turnout of minority voters, or racially marginalized populations voters. So again, the politics of race is being articulated in a very clear way in those two elections. By the time you get to 2016, there is a big response to what has happened in 2012. And if not a big response, at least a big change to what happened in 2012, and we get the result that we have now. So I think race as a political strategy of divide and maintain power, or divide and justify economic inequality, has been very effective, and it has been used in many societies as a strategy to both either justify or deny the racial advantage in which it represents. And so I think that the way to eliminate it, therefore, is not just say it goes away, because there are political interests, and they're very powerful political interests, which benefit from using race as a dividing point. I mentioned this book, and I encourage you to read it, by Du Bois, called Black Reconstruction is the title of the book. But his second chapter is called The White Worker. And so the first chapter, which was the black worker, the second chapter, the white worker, the conclusion of the white worker chapter is that there was this moment, okay, during the period of Reconstruction, where the black workers and the white workers could have joined common cause and had a significant impact on the political outcomes of the latter part of the 19th century. But the white workers refused to do that and begin a systematic process of disenfranchising the black workers, because the Klan, which was popular here and popular in the state that I'm in, the Klan was able to, and the Klan was not not just a middle class organization. The Klan was very much a grassroots, everyday people kind of organization, was able to help consolidate those political interests by a process of domestic terrorism. So I don't think it's as easy as simply not using the categories. There are institutional structures which have taken very strong shape in American society, and they use race as a way of inequitably distributing social, cultural, and economic power.
Okay, this will have to be the last question.
Thank you. I wanted to return briefly to this wonderful point about multi-heritage citizens and multi-ethnicity. I looked up some quick information and saw that the Census Bureau, for the first time, allowed people to check a category other than other in 2000, and approximately 6.8 million, or 2.4% of the population, said that they were more than one race able to check multiple boxes. And then by the 2010 census, 9 million individuals, or 2.9% of the population, self-identified as multiracial. And I think in our next census, it's likely to be much higher, which can, if I can create a word, complexify what is about to happen to our national conversation about one-dimensionalizing identity through categories of race. And it will be very interesting to see what happens. So just wanted to add a little more context. Thank you so much for your great talk.
Okay, that's everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.